The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as Mrs. Rosa Martinez slowly opened her eyes. The concrete beneath her back felt cold and unforgiving, even through the thin blanket she had wrapped around herself the night before. Her joints ached as she sat up, adjusting her position against the wooden walls of the small doghouse that had become her unlikely shelter. At 72 years old, Rosa had never imagined her life would come to this. She ran her weathered hands through her gray hair, trying to smooth it down before anyone might see her. The neighborhood was still sleeping, which gave her a few precious moments to compose herself and prepare for another day of invisible suffering. 3 months earlier, her world had been so different. Her son, Matthew, a sergeant in the army, had been preparing for deployment overseas. She remembered that last morning together in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and fresh bread filling the air as they shared what they both knew might be their final breakfast together for a long time. Matthew had looked so handsome in his uniform, his dark eyes serious but filled with love as he reached across the table to take her hand. At 28, he was strong and determined, but in that moment, he looked like the little boy who used to climb into her bed during thunderstorms. "Mom, I need you to know something," he had said, his voice steady but emotional. "Linda and I talked about this extensively. Your family, this is your home, and she understands that completely. She promised me she would take care of you while I'm gone." Rosa had nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. "Don't you worry about me, mi amor. You focus on staying safe and coming home to us. Linda is a good wife to you. We will take care of each other." Linda had been standing in the doorway, listening to their conversation. She was a petite woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, always impeccably dressed and carefully composed. When Matthew looked at her, she smiled and walked over to place her hand on Rosa's shoulder. "Of course, Matthew. Your mother is my mother now, too. She has nothing to worry about," Linda had said sweetly, though Rosa noticed something cold in her eyes that made her stomach flutter with unease. The deployment ceremony had been emotional. Rosa stood in the crowd of families, tears streaming down her face as she watched her only child, her pride and joy, march away with his unit. Matthew had looked back one final time, meeting her eyes across the distance, and mouthed the words, "I love you, Mom." The first few weeks after Matthew left had been manageable. Linda maintained a polite distance, but they coexisted peacefully in the house. Rosa kept to herself mostly, spending her days tending to the small garden in the backyard, cooking traditional Mexican meals that reminded her of her late husband, and writing letters to Matthew. But as the weeks turned into months, Linda's demeanor began to change. The polite smiles became forced, then disappeared altogether. Conversations became shorter and more clipped. Rosa noticed that Linda would often leave rooms when she entered them, and meals became solitary affairs, with Linda eating in her room or claiming she had already eaten. "Linda, dear, would you like to join me for dinner tonight?" Rosa had asked one evening, standing hopefully in the doorway of the living room where Linda was watching television. Without taking her eyes off the screen, Linda had responded coldly, "I'm not hungry. Please don't disturb me." Rosa had retreated to the kitchen, eating her homemade tamales alone at the table where she and Matthew used to share so many meals together. The silence in the house felt oppressive, broken only by the sound of her own chewing and the distant noise from Linda's television. As winter approached, the tension in the house became impossible to ignore. Linda began making passive-aggressive comments about grocery bills, utility costs, and the general expenses of having another person in the house. She would sigh loudly whenever Rosa was cooking, as if the very act of preparing food was an inconvenience. "You know, Rosa, food costs have really gone up lately," Linda said one morning, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. Rosa looked up from the stove where she was preparing eggs for breakfast. Of course, Linda, I can be more careful with the shopping. Would you like some eggs? I made plenty. I don't eat that kind of food, Linda replied dismissively, turning to leave. It's too greasy and unhealthy. The words stung more than Rosa cared to admit. She had been cooking traditional Mexican cuisine for over 50 years, recipes passed down from her mother and grandmother. To hear it dismissed so casually felt like a rejection of her entire heritage and identity. Phone calls with Matthew became increasingly difficult for Rosa to navigate. When he called, which was usually once a week depending on his location and mission status, Linda would answer and speak with him first, her voice suddenly warm and loving. "Oh, darling, I miss you so much. Everything here is fine, just fine. Your mother is doing well, keeping busy with her little projects," Linda would say, her tone completely different from the cold voice Rosa heard throughout the week. When it was Rosa's turn to speak, Matthew's voice would fill her heart with joy and longing. "Mom, how are you really doing? You sound different lately. Is everything okay with you and Linda?" Rosa would force brightness into her voice, not wanting to burden her son with problems while he was serving his country in dangerous conditions. "Everything is wonderful, mi amor. Linda takes good care of me. Don't worry about us. Tell me about what you're doing there." But inside, Rosa felt increasingly isolated and unwelcome in what was supposed to be her home. She began spending more time in her room, trying to stay out of Linda's way. She stopped cooking her traditional meals, instead preparing simple foods that wouldn't fill the house with aromas that seemed to irritate her daughter-in-law. The breaking point came on a particularly cold February evening. Rosa had been feeling unwell all day, running a slight fever and dealing with body aches that made even simple movements painful. She had spent most of the day in bed, only venturing out to make herself some tea and toast. Around 7 in the evening, she decided to prepare some soup, thinking the warm liquid might help her feel better. She was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of chicken soup, when Linda stormed into the kitchen. "What is that smell? It's making me sick," Linda snapped, her face twisted with disgust. "It's just soup, dear. I'm not feeling well, and I thought something warm might help," Rosa explained gently, not wanting to escalate the situation. "Well, it smells disgusting, and I can't stand it anymore. This whole house smells like you're cooking all the time. It's nauseating," Linda said, her voice rising with each word. Rosa turned off the burner and faced her daughter-in-law. "Linda, I'm sorry if my cooking bothers you. I've been trying to be more careful about what I prepare. Maybe we could talk about this calmly." "Talk about what? The fact that you've taken over this entire house? The fact that I can't even exist peacefully in my own home because there's always some smell or some noise from your activities?" Linda's composure was completely gone now, her face flushed with anger. "This is my son's house, too," Rosa said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady despite her growing anxiety. "Matthew asked you to take care of me while he was gone." "Matthew isn't here, is he? Matthew doesn't have to live with you day after day, dealing with your presence constantly. I never signed up for this. I married Matthew, not his entire family." The words hit Rosa like physical blows. She stood there, trembling slightly from her fever and from the emotional impact of Linda's outburst. "I have been trying so hard to stay out of your way," Rosa said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I barely use the common areas. I buy my own food most of the time. I don't understand what I've done wrong." "What you've done wrong is exist here when you shouldn't," Linda shot back cruelly. This is supposed to be my home with my husband, not some multi-generational living situation that I never wanted. The conversation continued to escalate, with Linda expressing months of pent-up resentment and Rosa trying desperately to understand how their relationship had deteriorated so completely. By the end of the argument, Linda was shouting about feeling trapped and overwhelmed, while Rosa stood in shocked silence, realizing that her presence had become genuinely unbearable to the woman her son loved. "I can't do this anymore," Linda finally said, her voice dropping to a cold, determined tone. "I can't pretend that this living situation works. You need to find somewhere else to stay." Rosa felt the world spin around her. "Linda, please, where would I go? Matthew is counting on both of us to take care of each other." "That's not my problem anymore. I've tried to make this work, but I'm done. You have until tomorrow morning to figure something out." With that, Linda stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Rosa standing alone next to her half-finished soup, the reality of her situation crashing down on her like a wave. Rosa spent that night lying awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had happened. She had some savings, but not enough for a deposit on an apartment. Her only relative was a cousin in Mexico whom she hadn't spoken to in years. Her few friends in the neighborhood were elderly themselves and couldn't take in a house guest indefinitely. The next morning, Linda made good on her ultimatum. Rosa woke to find her belongings packed in garbage bags and boxes stacked by the back door. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," Linda said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But I need my space back. I need my life back." Rosa looked around the home where she had lived for the past 8 months since Matthew's deployment, the place where she had felt safe and loved. Now it felt foreign and hostile. "Could I at least stay until Matthew calls this weekend so I can explain the situation to him myself?" Rosa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, this needs to happen now, or I'll never have the courage to follow through. Matthew will understand eventually." So Rosa found herself in the backyard, surrounded by her belongings, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The February air was bitter cold, and snow was beginning to fall lightly from the gray sky above. The doghouse in the corner of the yard had been built years earlier for a German shepherd that Matthew had owned as a teenager. The dog had passed away long before Rosa moved in, but the structure remained, weathered but still intact. It was about 4 feet high and 6 feet long, just big enough for Rosa to crawl inside and lie down. With no other options available, Rosa began moving her most essential belongings into the small space. A blanket, a pillow, a few changes of clothes, her medications, and a photograph of Matthew in his military uniform. Everything else would have to stay outside, covered with a tarp Linda had grudgingly provided. That first night in the doghouse was the longest of Rosa's life. The cold seeped through the wooden walls and up from the ground, making her bones ache even more than usual. She curled up in a ball, pulling the thin blanket around herself and trying to preserve body heat. The space was so small that she couldn't fully stretch out, and every position seemed to put pressure on some part of her aging body. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional pain. She thought about Matthew, somewhere overseas, trusting that his mother was safe and cared for. She thought about her late husband, Carlos, and how he would have been heartbroken to see her in this situation. She thought about the long life she had lived, the sacrifices she had made, the love she had given, and how it had all led to this moment of profound abandonment. Sleep came in brief, uncomfortable intervals, interrupted by the cold, by the hardness of the ground, and by the constant worry about what would happen to her next. Days turned into weeks, and Rosa established a routine that helped her survive. She would wake before dawn when the neighborhood was still quiet, and quickly use the outdoor water spigot to wash her face and hands. Linda had given her access to the garage bathroom, but only during certain hours when Linda herself wouldn't be inconvenienced. Rosa would spend her days walking around the neighborhood, sitting in the public library when it was open, and visiting the local park. She had to be careful with her money, buying only the most basic food items and eating as little as possible to make her savings last. Some days she would find herself dizzy from hunger, but she pushed through, knowing that each dollar spent was a dollar she might need later for something more critical. The hardest part was maintaining the pretense during Matthew's phone calls. Linda would still answer first, her voice bright and cheerful as she spoke to her husband. "Everything's great here, honey. Your mom is doing fine, staying busy with her activities. She's actually out right now, visiting with neighbors, but she'll be so disappointed she missed your call." When Rosa did get to speak with Matthew, she would position herself near the house, speaking quietly through the window so her voice wouldn't echo from the backyard. "Mom, you sound far away. Is everything okay with the phone?" "Yes, mi amor. Everything is fine. I'm just in the other room. Tell me about your mission. Are you staying safe?" Rosa became an expert at deflecting Matthew's questions and redirecting the conversation to his experiences overseas. She would listen to his stories about his fellow soldiers, about the local people he was working with, about the progress they were making in their mission. His voice was her lifeline, the thing that kept her going through the longest, coldest nights. As winter progressed into early spring, Rosa's health began to deteriorate. The constant exposure to cold and dampness, combined with poor nutrition and the stress of her situation, took a serious toll on her body. She developed a persistent cough that kept her awake at night, and her joints became increasingly stiff and painful. One particularly difficult morning, Rosa woke to find frost covering her blanket and her breath visible in small clouds inside the doghouse. She tried to stand up, but found herself too dizzy and weak to maintain her balance. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might be having a medical emergency with no one around to help her. She managed to crawl out of the doghouse and sit against the back wall of the main house, trying to gather her strength. Through the kitchen window, she could see Linda preparing breakfast, moving around the warm, comfortable space that had once been Rosa's home, too. The irony wasn't lost on Rosa that she was literally outside looking in at the life she had once been part of. She sat there for several minutes, watching Linda pour orange juice into a glass and toast bread in the toaster, simple domestic acts that now seemed luxurious and unreachable. That day, Rosa made a decision that went against every instinct she had. She decided to reach out for help. There was a community center about a mile away where she had sometimes seen people who appeared to be homeless getting meals and assistance. She had never imagined she would need such services herself, but pride seemed less important than survival. The walk to the community center was exhausting, and Rosa had to stop several times to rest and catch her breath. When she finally arrived, she found herself in line with people whose circumstances seemed even more desperate than her own. There were young people who looked like they might be struggling with addiction, older men who appeared to have been living on the streets for months or years, and families with small children who clutched their parents' hands and stared around with wide, uncertain eyes. Rosa felt a complex mix of gratitude and shame as she accepted a warm meal and information about local resources for people experiencing homelessness. The volunteer who helped her was kind and non-judgmental, but Rosa still felt like she was betraying some fundamental aspect of her identity by needing this kind of assistance. The walk to the community center was exhausting, and Rosa had to stop several times to rest and catch her breath. When she finally arrived, she found herself in line with people whose circumstances seemed even more desperate than her own. There were young people who looked like they might be struggling with addiction, older men who appeared to have been living on the streets for months or years, and families with small children who clutched their parents' hands and stared around with wide, uncertain eyes. Rosa felt a complex mix of gratitude and shame as she accepted a warm meal and information about local resources for people experiencing homelessness. The volunteer who helped her was kind and non-judgmental, but Rosa still felt like she was betraying some fundamental aspect of her identity by needing this kind of assistance. The meal was simple but nourishing, and Rosa ate slowly, savoring every bite and trying to store up energy for the walk back to her makeshift shelter. As she prepared to leave, the volunteer pressed a small card into her hand. "There are people who can help you find more permanent housing," the woman said gently. "You don't have to live like this." Rosa thanked her and put the card in her pocket, but she knew she couldn't pursue that kind of help. If she got involved with social services or housing assistance programs, there would be paperwork and questions, and eventually Matthew would find out what had happened. She couldn't bear the thought of him learning about her situation while he was overseas, unable to help and probably blaming himself for leaving her vulnerable. Spring slowly gave way to early summer, and Rosa's routine continued. She had lost a significant amount of weight, and her clothes hung loosely on her increasingly frail frame. Her cough had never fully gone away, and she often felt lightheaded and weak. But she persevered, driven by her determination to protect Matthew from knowledge that would cause him pain. Linda rarely acknowledged Rosa's presence anymore, though occasionally Rosa would catch her watching from windows with an expression that might have been guilt or might have been annoyance. They had established an unspoken system where Rosa would make herself scarce during certain hours, ensuring that Linda could come and go from the house without having to see or interact with her. On one particularly warm day in June, Rosa was resting in the shade of a large tree in the backyard when she heard Linda talking on the phone. The kitchen window was open, and Linda's voice carried clearly across the yard. "I know it sounds terrible, but I don't know what else to do. She just sits out there all day, and it makes me feel like a prisoner in my own home. When Matthew comes back, maybe things will be different, but right now I just can't handle the pressure." Rosa couldn't hear the voice on the other end of the conversation, but Linda's responses made it clear she was talking to someone who knew about the situation. "Of course I feel guilty. I'm not a monster. But Matthew doesn't understand what it's like to live with someone who's not really family, you know? Someone who represents all these obligations and expectations that I never signed up for." The conversation continued, but Rosa stopped listening. She curled up against the tree, pulling her thin blanket around her shoulders, and let the tears come. For months, she had held on to the hope that this situation was temporary, that Linda was just struggling with loneliness and stress, that eventually they could find a way to coexist peacefully. But hearing Linda's words made it clear that this wasn't a phase or a rough patch. This was Linda's true feelings about having Matthew's mother in her life. That night, as Rosa lay in the doghouse, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into sleep, She made a decision. She would find a way to move on from this situation, even if it meant losing contact with Matthew for a while. She couldn't continue living like this, and she couldn't continue being a source of stress and resentment for her son's wife. The next morning, Rosa began making plans. She would use the last of her savings to buy a bus ticket to San Antonio, where she knew there were larger homeless shelters and more resources for people in her situation. She would find a way to write to Matthew, explaining that she had decided to move closer to other family members without mentioning the real reason for her departure. It wasn't a perfect plan, and it broke her heart to think about being so far away from the place where Matthew would return, but it seemed like the only way to preserve whatever dignity she had left and to stop being a burden on people who clearly didn't want her around. Rosa spent that day gathering her few possessions and trying to figure out the logistics of her departure. She would leave early the next morning before Linda woke up and hopefully be on a bus heading south before anyone realized she was gone. But as she was organizing her belongings, she heard a sound that made her heart skip a beat. A car door slamming in the driveway, then another door, and then a voice that she knew better than her own. "Mom? Mom, where are you? I'm home." Rosa froze, her hands still holding the small bundle of clothes she had been packing. Matthew was home. He was supposed to be gone for another 2 months, but he was here, calling for her with joy and excitement in his voice. She heard the front door of the house open and close, heard Matthew's boots on the hardwood floor, heard Linda's surprised exclamation, and then their voices mixing together as they embraced after months apart. Rosa sat perfectly still in the doghouse, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and terror. Matthew was safe. He had made it home. But now he would discover what had happened, and she didn't know how to face that revelation. "Where's my mom?" she heard Matthew ask, his voice carrying across the yard. "I want to see her right away." She's around somewhere. You know how she likes to keep busy," Linda replied, and Rosa could hear the tension in her daughter-in-law's voice. "I'll find her. I have so much to tell her," Matthew said, and Rosa heard his footsteps moving through the house, opening doors, calling her name. Rosa knew she couldn't hide forever. In a few minutes, Matthew would search the backyard and find her crouched in this small wooden structure, surrounded by the meager possessions that represented all she had left in the world. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself and figure out how to explain the situation without causing too much pain or conflict. But before she could move, she heard Matthew's voice much closer. "Mom, are you out here?" And then she saw his boots in front of the doghouse, and his voice dropped to a whisper of shock and disbelief. "Mom? Oh my God, Mom, what are you doing in there?" Rosa looked up and saw her son's face, tanned from months in the desert sun, thinner than when he had left, but unmistakably her Matthew. His dark eyes were wide with confusion and growing horror as he took in the scene before him. "Mi amor," Rosa said softly, crawling out of the doghouse with as much dignity as she could muster. "You're home early. I wasn't expecting you." Matthew stared at her, then at the doghouse, then at the pile of belongings covered with a tarp, then back at his mother's face. Rosa could see him trying to process what he was seeing, trying to make sense of a situation that defied his understanding of how the world was supposed to work. "Mom, why are you sleeping out here? What happened to your room in the house?" Rosa stood up slowly, her joints protesting after the months of sleeping on the hard ground. She was acutely aware of how she must look to him, thinner and older and worn down by the hardships she had endured. "It's complicated, Matthew. There were some disagreements, and I thought it would be better if I gave Linda some space while you were away." "Disagreements? What kind of disagreements lead to my mother sleeping in a doghouse?" Matthew's voice was rising, and Rosa could see the anger beginning to build in his expression. "Please, let's not make a big scene about this. You just got home. This should be a happy time for you and Linda." But Matthew wasn't listening to her attempts at peacekeeping. He was staring at the doghouse, at her pile of belongings, at her obviously deteriorated physical condition, and Rosa could see him putting together a picture that was making him furious. "How long have you been living out here?" Rosa didn't answer immediately, and her silence was answer enough. "How long, Mom?" "A few months," she admitted quietly. "A few months? My mother has been sleeping outside for a few months while I've been overseas thinking she was safe and comfortable in our house." Matthew turned and walked toward the house, his stride long and determined. Rosa followed, afraid of what was about to happen, but knowing she couldn't stop it. "Linda!" Matthew's voice echoed through the house as he slammed the back door open. "Linda, get in here right now!" Rosa entered the house behind her son, taking in the familiar sights and smells of the place that had once been her home. Everything looked exactly the same, as if her presence had never made any impact at all. Linda appeared from the living room, her face pale and anxious. "Matthew, let me explain." "Explain? Explain how my mother ended up living in a doghouse while I was serving overseas. Explain how you could let me call home every week thinking she was safe and cared for? You don't understand the situation. She was impossible to live with. She took over the whole house with her cooking and her activities. I couldn't breathe in my own home." Rosa watched as her son absorbed his wife's words, his face growing darker with each excuse. "So your solution was to force my 72-year-old mother to sleep outside like an animal? I didn't force her to do anything. She chose to stay in the backyard rather than find somewhere else to live." "Find somewhere else to live? This is her home. This is our family home. She's not some stranger who overstayed her welcome." The argument continued, with Linda trying to justify her actions and Matthew's anger growing more intense. Rosa stood between them, feeling responsible for the conflict and desperately wishing she could make it stop. "Enough," Matthew finally said, his voice deadly quiet. "This conversation is over. Mom, go pack your things. You're moving back into your room immediately." "Matthew, if she moves back in here, then I'm leaving," Linda said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Then leave," Matthew replied without hesitation. "If you can treat my mother like this, then you're not the woman I thought I married." Rosa saw the shock on Linda's face, followed by tears, and she felt a wave of regret for the marriage that was crumbling in front of her. "Please, both of you, stop this fighting. Linda, I understand that living with me was difficult. Matthew, Linda was under a lot of stress while you were gone. Maybe we can find a solution that works for everyone." But Matthew was beyond compromise. He had spent months in dangerous conditions, sustained by thoughts of home and family, only to return and discover that his trust had been betrayed in the most fundamental way. "There is no solution that works for everyone, Mom. There's only right and wrong, and what happened to you was wrong." Over the next few hours, Matthew systematically restored his mother to her place in the household. He moved her belongings back into her old room, prepared a warm meal for her, and insisted that she take a long hot shower while he did her laundry. Linda remained in the house but kept to her own room, emerging only occasionally to make pointed comments about the impossibility of the situation and the unfairness of Matthew's decision. That evening, as Rosa sat at the kitchen table eating the first home-cooked meal she had enjoyed in months, Matthew sat across from her with his own plate. "I need you to tell me everything that happened while I was gone," he said gently. "I need to understand how this situation developed so I can make sure it never happens again." Rosa looked at her son, noting the new lines around his eyes and the way he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced serious challenges and survived. He was still her little boy, but he was also a man who had learned to take charge of difficult situations. "It started small," Rosa began, and she told him everything. The gradual cooling of Linda's attitude, the increasing restrictions and criticisms, the final argument that led to her exile to the backyard. She talked about the months of sleeping outside, the hunger, the cold, the loneliness, and the constant worry about being discovered. Matthew listened without interrupting, his expression growing more somber as the story unfolded. When Rosa finished, they sat in silence for several minutes. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I wasn't here to protect you." "You were serving your country, mi amor. You were doing important work. I didn't want to distract you with problems at home." "You're not a problem. You're my mother. You're the reason I had a home to come back to, a foundation to build my life on. Anyone who can't understand that doesn't belong in this family." The next morning, Matthew had a long conversation with Linda that Rosa could hear through the walls of the house. It was clear that Linda was trying to repair the damage, apologizing and promising that things would be different now that Matthew was home. But Matthew's response was firm and final. "The problem isn't that you couldn't get along with my mother. The problem is that when you couldn't get along with her, your solution was to force her to live outside like she was worthless. That tells me something about who you are as a person, and it's not someone I can stay married to." Within a week, Linda had moved out, and divorce proceedings had begun. Rosa felt guilty about the dissolution of her son's marriage, but Matthew was clear that the marriage had ended the moment Linda decided to treat his mother as disposable. "A marriage should be about joining families, not destroying them," he told Rosa as they worked together in the garden, replanting the vegetables that had withered during her months of exile. "Someone who could do what Linda did to you would eventually do something similar to me or to our children if we had them. I'm better off knowing who she really is now rather than finding out later." As summer progressed, Matthew transitioned back to civilian life and found work with a security company that valued his military experience. He and Rosa established new routines that honored both his independence as a grown man and their deep bond as mother and son. Matthew converted the garage into a workshop where he could pursue woodworking as a hobby, and he built Rosa a beautiful new garden bed where she could grow all the herbs and vegetables she needed for her traditional cooking. The kitchen once again filled with the aromas that Linda had found so objectionable, but now they represented a celebration of Rosa's culture and contribution to the household. In the evenings, they would sit on the back porch, Rosa with her knitting and Matthew with whatever book he was reading, comfortable in each other's company in a way that had been deepened by their separation and the trials they had endured. "I learned something important while I was overseas," Matthew said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "What did you learn, mi amor?" "I learned that home isn't a place, it's the people who love you unconditionally and who would sacrifice anything to keep you safe. You did that for me my whole life, and when I came back and saw what had happened to you, I realized that protecting you is how I protect what home really means." Rosa reached over and took her son's hand, feeling the calluses he had earned through military service and physical labor, but also feeling the gentleness that had always been part of his character. "You know, when I was sleeping in that doghouse, the thing that kept me going wasn't the hope that my situation would improve. It was knowing that I had raised a son who would always do the right thing, no matter how difficult it might be. Even when I couldn't see how things would get better, I knew that you would come home eventually and you would make things right. I should have been here to prevent it from happening in the first place. No, mi amor, you were exactly where you needed to be, doing exactly what you needed to do. And when you came home, you handled the situation exactly the way I knew you would, with strength, with conviction, and with love." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In the distance, Rosa could see the doghouse where she had spent so many cold, difficult nights. Matthew had offered to tear it down, but Rosa had asked him to leave it standing. "Why do you want to keep it?" he had asked. "Because it reminds me that I survived something I never thought I could survive. It reminds me that even when everything seemed hopeless, I had the strength to keep going because I knew my son would come home to me eventually. I should have been here to prevent it from happening in the first place. No, mi amor, you were exactly where you needed to be, doing exactly what you needed to do. And when you came home, you handled the situation exactly the way I knew you would, with strength, with conviction, and with love." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In the distance, Rosa could see the doghouse where she had spent so many cold, difficult nights. Matthew had offered to tear it down, but Rosa had asked him to leave it standing. "Why do you want to keep it?" he had asked. "Because it reminds me that I survived something I never thought I could survive. It reminds me that even when everything seemed hopeless, I had the strength to keep going because I knew my son would come home to me eventually." The doghouse stood in the corner of the yard, weathered and empty, a testament to human resilience and the unbreakable bonds of family love. 6 months after Matthew's return, Rosa received a letter that surprised her. It was from Linda, postmarked from a city several states away. "Dear Mrs. Martinez," the letter began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you choose not to read this letter or respond to it. But I needed to try to explain myself and to apologize for the way I treated you." The letter went on to describe Linda's struggles with feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities of marriage and her fear of losing her independence. She acknowledged that her behavior had been cruel and inexcusable, and she expressed genuine remorse for the suffering she had caused. "I know that my apology cannot undo the months of hardship you endured because of my selfishness," Linda wrote. "But I wanted you to know that I think about what I did every day, and I am working with a counselor to understand why I was capable of such cruelty towards someone who never did anything but try to be kind to me." Rosa showed the letter to Matthew, who read it without comment and handed it back to her. "What do you think I should do?" Rosa asked. "Whatever feels right to you, Mom. You're the one who was wronged. You're the one who gets to decide whether forgiveness is possible." Rosa thought about the letter for several days before responding. When she finally wrote back, her response was brief but heartfelt. Dear Linda, I forgive you, not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying anger towards you would only cause me more suffering. I hope you are able to find peace and to treat others with greater kindness in the future. I wish you well in your new life. She never heard from Linda again, but sending that letter felt like closing a chapter that had been painful for everyone involved. As Rosa's first winter back in the house approached, she and Matthew worked together to make sure she would be comfortable and warm. Matthew installed a small heater in her room and made sure all the windows were properly sealed. He also built her a beautiful wooden chest where she could store extra blankets and warm clothes. I never want you to be cold again, he said as he showed her the new heater. I won't be cold, mi amor, not as long as I'm home with you. On Christmas morning, Rosa woke to the smell of coffee and fresh bread, just like that last morning before Matthew's deployment almost 2 years earlier. But this Christmas was different because they both understood now how precious and fragile family bonds could be. Over breakfast, Matthew presented Rosa with a gift that made her cry. It was a photo album filled with pictures from his deployment, but also pictures of the house and garden that he had asked neighbors to take while he was gone. The final page contained a professional photograph of Rosa and Matthew together with an inscription that read, "Home is wherever we're together." I want to make sure we never take each other for granted again, Matthew said as Rosa wiped away her tears. We won't, mi amor. We know now what it means to almost lose each other. We know how to hold on tighter to what matters most. Later that morning, as they prepared Christmas dinner together in the kitchen, Rosa looked out the window at the backyard where she had spent those difficult months. The garden was dormant now, but she could see the promise of spring in the carefully tended soil. The doghouse still stood in the corner, but it no longer represented desperation and abandonment. Now it was simply part of the landscape, a reminder of a chapter that had ended and a new one that had begun. Matthew, there's something I want to tell you, Rosa said as she rolled out dough for tamales, a Christmas tradition they had missed the year before. What is it, Mom? When I was living outside, I used to lie awake at night thinking about all the things I wished I had said to you before you left for deployment. All the advice I wanted to give you, all the stories I wanted to share, all the ways I wanted to tell you how proud I was of the man you had become. Matthew stopped chopping vegetables and turned to face his mother fully. I thought about those things too, especially after I found you in the doghouse. I realized how much time we waste assuming we'll always have more opportunities to say the important things. Exactly. So I want to make sure I tell you now, while we're both here and safe, you are the greatest accomplishment of my life. Not because of your military service, though I'm proud of that too, but because of the way you treat people, the way you stood up for me, the way you refused to accept that someone you loved could be treated badly. That tells me everything about the kind of man you are. Rosa paused in her rolling to look directly at her son. Your father would have been so proud of you. He would have done exactly the same thing you did. I hope so. I tried to think about what he would want me to do, how he would want me to handle the situation. You handled it perfectly, mi amor. You protected your family without being cruel to Linda. You were firm, but not vindictive. You showed strength and compassion at the same time. They continued working on the Christmas dinner, their conversation flowing naturally between serious topics and lighter moments. Rosa told Matthew stories about his childhood that she had never shared before, and Matthew told her about the friends he had made during his deployment, the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned about himself. As the afternoon progressed, neighbors began stopping by to welcome Matthew home and to check on Rosa. Word had spread through the community about what had happened, and Rosa was touched by the outpouring of support from people she had known for years but had never felt particularly close to. Mrs. Chen from next door brought a casserole and stayed for an hour, sharing her own stories about caring for elderly parents and the challenges of multi-generational living. Mr. Rodriguez from across the street brought fresh bread from his bakery and offered Matthew a part-time job if he ever needed extra income. "I had no idea you were going through such a difficult time," Mrs. Chen said to Rosa as they sat in the living room. "I wish you had felt comfortable asking for help." "I was too proud and too worried about causing problems for Matthew while he was away," Rosa admitted. "But I've learned that pride can be dangerous when it prevents you from accepting help from people who care about you." "Well, you have help now, whether you ask for it or not. This neighborhood looks after its own." As evening approached and the last of the visitors departed, Rosa and Matthew settled in the living room with cups of hot chocolate and slices of the flan Rosa had made for dessert. "This has been the best Christmas I've had in years," Matthew said, stretching out in his father's old armchair. "Even with everything that happened, all the drama with Linda, the divorce, the upheaval, especially because of everything that happened, it showed me what really matters and what doesn't. It showed me that our family is strong enough to survive real challenges." Rosa smiled, thinking about how much they had both grown through their trials. "You know, when I was a little girl in Mexico, my grandmother used to tell me that families are like trees. The storms might bend them and break off some branches, but if the roots are strong, the tree will survive and grow even stronger." I like that metaphor. We definitely weathered a storm, didn't we? We did, and now we know our roots are strong enough to hold us steady through whatever comes next. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to Christmas music on the radio and watching the lights twinkle on the small tree Matthew had set up in the corner of the room. "I've been thinking about the future," Matthew said eventually, "about what I want to do with my life now that I'm back home." "Tell me what you're thinking, mi amor." "I want to go back to school, use my military benefits to get a degree in social work. I want to help other families who are going through difficult situations, especially elderly people who might be vulnerable to neglect or abuse." Rosa felt a surge of pride at her son's words. "That sounds like perfect work for you. You have the heart for it and the life experience to understand what people are going through." "I keep thinking about how easily you could have disappeared into the system, become just another homeless elderly person that society ignores. It makes me angry, but it also makes me want to do something constructive about the problem." "Your father always said that the best way to deal with anger about injustice is to channel it into action that helps other people. I think he would approve of your plan." Matthew leaned forward in his chair, his expression earnest and determined. "I also want to make sure you're set up for the future, Mom. I want to put your name on the deed to this house so you never have to worry about having a secure place to live. I want to make sure your health care is covered and that you have enough money saved for any emergencies that might come up." "Matthew, you don't need to worry about taking care of me financially. I have my Social Security and some savings." "It's not about need, Mom. It's about want. I want to take care of you the same way you took care of me when I was growing up. I want to make sure you never have to choose between pride and safety again." Rosa felt tears forming in her eyes as she absorbed her son's words. After months of feeling like a burden, of believing that her presence was unwanted and problematic, It was overwhelming to hear Matthew speak about caring for her as something he wanted to do rather than something he felt obligated to do. You know what the hardest part was during those months outside? Rosa asked. Tell me. It wasn't the cold or the hunger or even the physical discomfort. It was feeling like I didn't matter to anyone anymore, like I was invisible and disposable, like all the years of loving and caring for people hadn't earned me the right to be loved and cared for in return. Matthew got up from his chair and sat on the couch next to his mother, taking her hands in his. You matter to me more than anything else in the world. You always have and you always will. What happened with Linda doesn't change that or diminish it in any way. I know that now, but there were nights when I wasn't sure, when the loneliness and rejection made me doubt everything I thought I knew about my place in the world. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I'm sorry my marriage put you in a position where you felt unwanted in your own home. Don't apologize for trying to build a life with someone you loved. That's what you were supposed to do. Linda and I just weren't compatible as family members, and that's no one's fault, really. It became someone's fault when she decided to solve the problem by forcing you to live outside. That's when it stopped being about compatibility and started being about basic human decency. Rosa squeezed her son's hands, marveling at the strength and gentleness she felt in his grip. The important thing is that you came home and you made things right. You chose family over everything else, and that means more to me than I could ever express. As the evening grew late, they began cleaning up the remnants of their Christmas celebration. Rosa washed dishes while Matthew put away leftover food and tidied the living room. I have an idea for tomorrow, Matthew said as he folded the tablecloth they had used for dinner. What kind of idea? I want to take you shopping for new clothes, new bedding, new everything. I want you to have things that are yours, that make you feel comfortable and at home. Matthew, you don't need to spend money on those things. I have what I need. Mom, most of your clothes are worn out from months of being stored outside and washed in cold water. Your blankets are thin and old. I want you to have nice things that make you feel valued and cared for. Rosa thought about the pile of belongings that had been her only possessions during her time of exile, how everything had become shabby and weathered during those difficult months. Actually, that sounds wonderful. It would be nice to have some new things. Good. And then I want to take you to get your hair done professionally. And maybe we can stop by the community center where you used to get meals. I want to make a donation there, but I also want them to meet you when you're not in crisis. I want them to see you as the dignified, remarkable woman you are. Rosa felt a warmth spreading through her chest at the thoughtfulness of her son's plans. He understood intuitively that part of her healing would involve reclaiming her sense of self-worth and dignity. You've grown into such a wise man, Matthew. When did you become so good at knowing what people need? I learned from watching you, Mom. All those years of seeing how you took care of Dad when he was sick, how you took care of me when I was growing up, how you always seemed to know exactly what would make people feel better. I just tried to apply those same principles to taking care of you. That night, as Rosa prepared for bed in her own room, surrounded by her own familiar belongings, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The months of hardship had been genuine suffering, but they had also revealed the unshakable strength of the bond between her and Matthew. She looked out her bedroom window at the backyard, peaceful and quiet under the starlit sky. The doghouse was barely visible in the darkness, but she knew it was there, a reminder of her resilience and her son's love. Over the following months, Matthew kept his promise to return to school, enrolling in a social work program at the local community college. He studied in the evenings while working during the day, and Rosa helped by preparing meals and maintaining the household so he could focus on his studies. Rosa also found new purpose in her own life. She began volunteering at the community center where she had received help during her most difficult period, working in the kitchen and helping to serve meals to people experiencing homelessness. Her own experience gave her a unique understanding of what the clients were going through, and she became known for her ability to offer comfort and encouragement to people who had lost hope. Mrs. Martinez, you always seem to know exactly what to say to people, one of the other volunteers remarked as they cleaned up after a busy lunch service. I've been where they are, Rosa replied simply. I know what it feels like to believe that no one cares whether you live or die. Sometimes, just having someone acknowledge your dignity can make all the difference. Matthew often picked up Rosa after her volunteer shifts, and he was amazed by the transformation he saw in her. The months of living outside had aged her physically, but returning to a sense of purpose and community had restored her spirit in a remarkable way. You seem happier now than you did even before I left for deployment, he observed one day as they drove home together. I think I am happier. Going through such a difficult experience taught me not to take anything for granted. Every warm meal, every comfortable bed, every kind conversation feels like a gift now. I worry that the trauma of what happened might have lasting effects on you. Rosa considered his concern carefully before responding. The experience was traumatic, yes, but it was also educational. I learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was. I learned that I can survive things I never imagined having to survive. And most importantly, I learned that you will always be there for me when I need you most. As spring returned and Rosa began working in her garden again, she found herself thinking often about cycles and seasons, about how endings could become beginnings, and about how the most difficult experiences could sometimes lead to unexpected growth and renewal. The vegetables she planted that spring grew more abundantly than any she had grown before, as if the soil had been enriched by everything that had happened in that backyard. She shared the harvest with neighbors, with the community center, and with anyone who seemed to need fresh, nutritious food. Matthew graduated from his social work program with honors and was immediately hired by a nonprofit organization that provided services to vulnerable elderly adults. His first assignment was developing a program to identify and assist elderly people who might be at risk of neglect or abuse by family members. It's like the work found me instead of me finding the work, he told Rosa as they celebrated his new job. Sometimes that's how the best work comes to us. We go through experiences that prepare us to help other people going through similar experiences. Rosa watched with pride as Matthew threw himself into his new career with passion and dedication. He worked long hours, but he always made time for family dinners and evening conversations. Their relationship had developed new depth and appreciation following the crisis they had weathered together. One evening, almost a year after Matthew's return from deployment, they were sitting on the back porch when Rosa brought up a subject they had never discussed directly. "Matthew, do you ever regret divorcing Linda?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret that the marriage didn't work out. I regret that I didn't see her true character before I married her. But I don't regret choosing you over her when I was forced to make that choice. Even though it means starting over, finding someone new. Mom, anyone who could treat you the way Linda did isn't someone I would want to build a life with. The right person for me will understand that you're part of the package, and they'll be grateful to have you as family rather than resentful. I hope you find someone like that someday. I hope I didn't ruin your chance at having a family of your own." Matthew turned to face his mother directly. "You are my family. You're the most important family I'll ever have. If I'm fortunate enough to find someone to marry and have children with, they'll be additions to our family, not replacements for it." Rosa felt a deep sense of peace at her son's words. She had worried that her presence in his life might be an obstacle to his future happiness, but Matthew clearly saw her as an essential part of whatever family he might build. "I would like to meet your future wife someday," Rosa said with a smile. "I promise to be much more flexible and accommodating than I was with Linda." You were perfectly flexible and accommodating with Linda. She was the one who couldn't adapt to sharing space with family. The right woman will appreciate your cooking and your wisdom and your presence in our lives. As the seasons continued to cycle and their new life together found its rhythm, Rosa often reflected on the lesson she had learned during her time of greatest difficulty. She had learned that dignity was something that came from within rather than from external circumstances. She had learned that family bonds could survive tremendous stress if they were built on genuine love and respect. And she had learned that endings, even painful ones, could lead to beginnings that were richer and more meaningful than what had come before. The doghouse remained in the corner of the backyard, weathered but sturdy, a quiet testament to resilience and survival. Rosa no longer saw it as a symbol of her abandonment and suffering. Now it represented her strength, her ability to endure, and the unbreakable connection between a mother and son who had proven that their love could survive any test. Sometimes, when she was working in the garden, Rosa would glance over at the small wooden structure and remember the coldest nights, the hungriest days, the moments when hope seemed impossible to maintain. But those memories no longer filled her with sadness or bitterness. Instead, they reminded her of how far she had traveled from that dark time to this bright present. Matthew often worked in the garden beside her, and they would talk about his cases at work, about the elderly clients he was helping, about the families he was trying to keep together or reconcile. Rosa's insights, born from her own experience of vulnerability and recovery, frequently helped Matthew understand how to approach difficult situations with greater compassion and effectiveness. "You know what I think made the difference for us?" Rosa said one Saturday morning as they harvested tomatoes together. "What's that, Mom?" "We never stopped believing that family means something. Even when Linda couldn't see it, even when I was living outside feeling forgotten, we both held on to the idea that family members have obligations to each other that go beyond convenience or personal comfort." "That's true. I think that's what made me so angry when I came home and found you in the doghouse. It wasn't just that you were suffering. It was that the promise of family had been broken. And now we've rebuilt that promise, made it even stronger than it was before." Matthew smiled, wiping dirt from his hands on an old towel. "We have, and I think we've both learned not to take it for granted." As the story of Rosa and Matthew's reunion spread through their community, it became a source of inspiration for other families facing their own challenges. People began reaching out to them for advice, for support, for examples of how family loyalty could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Rosa found herself becoming an informal counselor to other elderly parents who were struggling with difficult relationships with their adult children or in-laws. Her gentle wisdom and lived experience made her someone people trusted with their most painful family secrets. Matthew's work with vulnerable elderly adults was informed daily by his mother's experience and insights. He became known throughout the social services community as someone who understood both the professional and personal dimensions of elder care and family dynamics. Together, They had transformed their personal tragedy into a source of healing and help for others. The suffering Rosa had endured in the doghouse had not been meaningless. It had become the foundation for a deeper understanding of human resilience and the true meaning of family love. Years passed, and Rosa continued to thrive in her role as Matthew's mother, volunteer, and informal community elder. Matthew eventually met and married a woman named Sarah, who immediately embraced Rosa as the mother she had lost to cancer several years earlier. Their wedding was held in the backyard, under a canopy of lights that twinkled like stars, with Rosa officiating the ceremony as an ordained minister through an online program she had completed as a surprise gift to the couple. On her 80th birthday, Rosa stood in the same backyard where she had once slept rough and cold, surrounded by 3 generations of family and friends. Matthew's twin daughters, now 5 years old, played in the garden she maintained with such love and dedication. Sarah was pregnant with their 3rd child, and Rosa was already planning the traditional Mexican dishes she would prepare for the baby's christening celebration. The doghouse was still there, now serving as a playhouse for the grandchildren who had no idea of its significance in their family's history. Rosa had told them it was a special house where people learned to be strong and brave, which was true in its own way. As the birthday celebration continued into the evening, Rosa found herself standing alone for a moment, looking up at the stars that had kept her company during those long, difficult nights years earlier. She felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment of joy and abundance. Matthew appeared beside her, now graying at the temples, but still the devoted son who had carried her from desperation to security in his strong, gentle arms. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" "I'm thinking about how lucky we are, how much love we have in our lives, how much we've grown from the challenges we face together." "I'm thinking the same thing. You know what I realized today, watching you with the grandchildren, seeing how happy Sarah is to have you as her mother-in-law?" "What did you realize?" "That doghouse was never really about you losing your home. It was about finding out what home really means. It's not about the building or the comfort or the convenience. It's about the people who will never give up on each other, no matter what." Rosa smiled, taking her son's arm as they walked back toward the house, filled with laughter and music and the voices of people who loved each other unconditionally. "You're right, mi amor. Home is wherever family is, and we're finally, truly home." The doghouse stood quietly in the corner of the yard, holding its secrets and its lessons, a small wooden monument to the power of love to overcome abandonment, of loyalty to triumph over convenience, and of family bonds to survive even the most challenging tests. It remained there not as a reminder of suffering, but as a testament to the truth that real homes are built not of wood and walls, but of hearts that refuse to let each other go.